Okay, Glenn, good to see you again.
Good to be with you.
Almost 2 years after the first revelations of Edward Snowden, how do you see the general state of privacy in the world, and especially in the US?
I see it as significantly improved as compared to, say, 2 years ago prior to the disclosures enabled by Edward Snowden. Obviously, the US government hasn't limited its own spying powers. They're spying as much as ever, if not more so. But that was never really the expectation that they would limit themselves, but all kinds of other limitations have been imposed on them, from the work of foreign governments to work together to reconstruct the internet, to think about how to avoid having it go on US soil, to the pressure on Silicon Valley companies to start protecting the privacy of their users instead of compromising it with encryption and other products. And then the knowledge that individuals around the world have for the first time about the extent to which their privacy is being compromised, which has enabled them to use encryption and other technological tools to protect their privacy, which they're doing at far greater rates than before.
You mentioned the efforts of the companies. Is this because here at the CeBIT it's also an issue, the security, and some companies are promoting it and are advertising it? So is it? Do you see some hypocrisy in it, or is it a real effort? How would you evaluate it?
I think it's both. I mean, I think that 3 or 4 years ago, when big tech companies talked about privacy, they were doing it without any authenticity at all, because as we now know, secretly they were collaborating with the NSA and other government surveillance agencies far greater than what the law required. They don't care at all about their users' privacy. But what they do care about is their future business prospects, and they're genuinely petrified that if the next generation of users on the internet, or the one after that, or even the current one, continues to perceive that they're collaborators with surveillance agencies, they will lose their business, and they'll be vulnerable to pitches from German or Brazilian or South Korean social media companies that say, don't use Facebook or Google or Microsoft or Yahoo because they'll give your data to the NSA. You should use us instead. And I do think there's a genuine effort now on their part, not because they care about privacy, but because they care about their business, to demonstrate a genuine commitment to privacy. And there's a real conflict between governments and these companies now, because these companies really are starting to embed their products with sophisticated encryption.
When I started to cover the Snowden revelations, I always thought that, oh my God, these companies, they pretend that they didn't know. So you have insight in all these documents. So can you tell us whether they knew or whether they didn't know?
Well, I mean, just look at the documents that already have been published, beginning with PRISM, which was basically a collaborative effort between the NSA and all of these corporations. But then even beyond that, we published a story, I think in September of 2013, about the constant meetings between Microsoft and the NSA to find ways for the NSA to invade the encryption products that Microsoft was touting to their users as something that would protect their privacy. And they were building backdoors and building all kinds of access routes into Skype at the very same time that Microsoft was telling the world that Skype was not susceptible to being eavesdropped on. So when there was no cost to doing this, meaning when they could do it in the dark, the partnership between Silicon Valley and the government was basically limitless. And that has been one of the things that has changed most significantly, is that now there is a huge cost to having this cooperation. And you see, rather than being collaborative and cooperative, there's actually a great deal of conflict now between these companies and these surveillance agencies, and that conflict is really healthy, and I hope it continues.
Yeah, looking at the development after the first revelation, so how do you evaluate the role of European governments? Can they also put pressure on the US government to say stop it? Because our chancellor, for example, said, okay, it's not good among friends to spy on me, like for that. Is there some way that governments from Europe can influence the American government?
Sure, they could. European governments actually exercise a fair degree of influence and power in the world. The question always is whether or not they actually intend to use it in defense of the values that they claim to have. I think European leaders are traditionally very good at standing up and giving very pretty speeches, at defending values with their words and rhetoric that sound really inspiring and really good. But when it comes time to actually paying some kind of a price or taking some sort of a risk in defense of those values, I think the record is much less inspiring. And so, of course, there are all kinds of ways that these governments could put pressure on the US to limit their surveillance, but the reality is that they tend to be much more subservient to the US and willing to confront it. And at the same time, these governments in the beginning pretended to be outraged victims of this surveillance, and the reality is they're partners and participants in much of the electronic surveillance as well, and beneficiaries of it also. So the role of European governments in this whole spying controversy was, in the first instance, presented in much simpler and more moralistic terms than reality merited. Their role is both as victim but also as perpetrator, and I don't think you've seen much genuine effort on the part of European governments to impose limits as opposed to speeches that they like to give pretending that they are.
Concerning the documents, you said in December or last year sometimes that you want to install a room in New York where all, or where interested journalists at least can have a look. Is this going forward? Or?
It is. I mean, as you can imagine, there are all kinds of serious legal and technical complications when you're trying to take many tens of thousands of top secret documents from the world's most powerful government and share them with foreign media outlets. That's not an easy thing to do. So you end up meeting endlessly with lawyers, with technical and security people about the ways to do that. We have a responsibility to protect the archive and to make certain that it's not used in ways that our source didn't want. So it's taking a little bit longer than we would like, but absolutely that is still a work in progress, and we hope to be done with that very soon.
And when will it work? So within the year or next year? Or?
No, definitely this year.
Later you will talk to, or Edward Snowden will be with us here, so what can we expect from that conversation you will have tonight?
I don't know. I mean, I'm interested to see as well. You know, I think that he's been pretty consistent about the fact that he did what he did in order to take a stand in defense of the rights of individuals, not just to have their privacy protected, but in order to participate in democracy, and that he feels very at peace with the choice that he made. He feels gratified by the debate that has been triggered around the world and by the steps that have been taken that I described earlier that are helping to protect privacy. So I think he's been pretty consistent about why he did what he did and how he views the ensuing debate.
What do you think? Where does he take the strength to be like that, as you described? Why is he so strong to be like he is?
I think if you look actually at human history and you look at individuals who have taken enormous risks and engage in very brave acts of conscience, you find generally that they have an enormous amount of internal peace, because once you reach the conclusion that you have an obligation as a human being, morally or ethically, to engage in certain behavior, and then you get yourself to do it, I think it brings this internal tranquility and contentedness. And that's why people in the United States always say, oh, it must be terrible for Edward Snowden to be living in Russia and not to be able to come home and see his family and all of that. And all of that may be true, but he's actually probably the single happiest person I know, because this internal tranquility that comes from knowing you did the right thing is so much more valuable than any material comfort or anything else. And I think anyone who interacts with him says the same thing.
Thank you, Glenn.
All right, thank you. Appreciate it.